In the village of Oredo, they say the Wailing Hill does not grow crops, it grows consequences. But Mama Anita had debts to pay and a son to feed, and she decided that ancient warnings were a luxury only comfortable people could afford. The story opens during market day, when Mama Anita's bruised, undersized tubers draw open laughter from the women with full baskets. While other villagers cluster around the lush abundance of the upper farms, Mama Anita's eyes drift to the Wailing Hill, emerald green, impossibly fertile, and completely silent. No bird sings above it. No insect buzzes near it. But the soil there is black as midnight and rich as promise. The intro establishes Mama Anita's fatal flaw, a stubborn intellectual pride that dismisses ancestral wisdom as the superstition of frightened men, and a mother's love twisted by shame into something dangerous. Baba Tunde saw the red moon 3 nights before anyone else thought to look up. He came to the village square at dawn, his walking stick carving slow circles in the dust, and gathered whoever would listen, which, on that particular morning, was mostly children and old women. The watchers are restless, he said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had been ignored before and expected to be ignored again. When the moon bleeds red above the Wailing Hill, it means the boundary between their world and ours has grown thin. No one should go near that place. No digging. No clearing. No disturbing of any kind. Mama Anita was passing with a basket of bruised tubers balanced on her head, already late for market. She slowed just long enough to listen, then made a sound in the back of her throat that communicated everything she felt about old men and their moon-watching. Baba Tunde, with respect, she said, not stopping, when last did your warnings fill a pot? The moon turns red every harmattan season. Meanwhile, my son needs school fees and my roof needs fixing. She adjusted the basket and kept walking. Pray for us. That is more useful. The old man called after her. Anita. Your mother knew that hill. Your grandmother knew it. Their wisdom didn't come from fear, it came from experience. They were also poor their whole lives, she called back without turning around. The children watching from the compound fence giggled. The old women exchanged glances that carried the weight of prophecy. Baba Tunde stood in the dust and watched her go. He'd seen this before, not Anita specifically, but the particular posture of a person who had decided that hunger excused them from consequences. It never did. It only made the consequences arrive faster. That evening, he went to his doorstep and looked at the Wailing Hill against the darkening sky. The red moon hung directly above it, fat and bleeding. And in the silence below it, something that wasn't wind moved through the tall grass at the hill's base, slow, deliberate, aware. He went inside, bolted his door, and prayed for the village. He prayed specifically for a woman who confused courage with recklessness and love with ambition. He prayed, but he didn't believe it would be enough. Mama Anita rose before the village woke, before the roosters, before even the light. She'd spent the night lying on her tin mattress calculating the debts, the fees, the cost of a new roof before the rains came. By 3 in the morning, she'd stopped calculating and started deciding. She wrapped her headscarf tight, picked up her machete, and walked to the Wailing Hill in the dark. The path to the hill was well known but deliberately untraveled, a narrow trail through overgrown grass that the whole village collectively pretended didn't exist. Mama Anita walked it with a lantern in one hand and the machete in the other, her jaw set, her heart beating faster than she would have admitted. The hill was different at night. During the day, its impossible greenness looked merely strange. In the dark, it felt intentional, like a living thing that had been waiting for her specifically. The air temperature dropped as she climbed, though there was no wind. Her lantern flickered once, violently, then steadied. She raised the machete and brought it down on the first shrub. The sound the ground made wasn't the usual thud of metal meeting soil. It was lower, wetter, almost organic, like striking something that had been breathing. A dark liquid, thick and slow as sap but the color of old blood, welled up from the cut earth and poured in the gash before slowly disappearing back into the soil. Mama Anita stared at it. She knelt, pressed her finger to the ground. It came away dark-stained, and the smell that rose from the soil was not earth but something older, the specific, mineral smell of very old bones. She should have left. Every reasonable instinct in her body told her to put down the machete and walk back down the hill and forget she'd ever come. But then she thought of David's school fees, of the women laughing at her bruised tubers, of another year of almost enough and never quite right. She raised the machete again. By the time the sun rose, she had cleared half the hill. The birds that normally fill the morning with noise were completely absent. Not just from the hill, from the entire surrounding area. The village woke to a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. Mama Anita wiped her machete on the grass and looked at the rich, black soil she'd exposed. It was the most beautiful earth she'd ever seen. She went home to fetch her planting tools, and behind her, the hill said nothing. It simply watched. And waited. The cassava grew in 3 weeks. That alone should have ended it. Cassava takes months, every farmer knows this, every child who has ever watched their parents' fields knows the slow arithmetic of growing things. But the shoots Mama Anita pressed into the Wailing Hill's black soil pushed through the ground within days, and by the 3rd week, the plant stood knee-high and impossibly lush. She told no one. She visited the hill before sunrise and after sunset, her movements careful and private, her expression arranged into ordinary blankness whenever she passed neighbors on the path. The harvest was building beautifully. She had already started planning how she would present it, casually, as if she'd simply found good soil on an unused corner of her family plot. Ordinary good fortune. Nothing to explain. It was on the 22nd day that she found the tuber. She was digging in the northeast corner of the cleared land, pulling cassava roots that had matured faster than any she'd grown before, when her hoe struck something that didn't give way. She dug around it carefully, expecting a rock. What she uncovered made her hands go still. The tuber was enormous, as long as her arm from elbow to fingertip, and as wide as a man's thigh. But its shape was wrong. Where cassava roots are cylindrical and uniform, this one was shaped like a torso, broadening at what would be shoulders, narrowing at a waist, with 2 stump projections below that could only be called legs. The skin of it was darker than the others, almost black, and when Mama Anita pressed her thumb against it, it was warm. Not room temperature warm. Not sun-warmed. Warm the way living things are warm, from the inside. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. The smart thing, the clearly right thing, was to leave it in the ground, walk away, and not come back. But it was also the largest, healthiest tuber she'd ever seen. At market, it would fetch 3 times the price of a normal root. She cut it free with her machete and carried it home in a separate bag, wrapped in cloth so she wouldn't have to look at its shape. That night, David came to her in the kitchen while she was making dinner. "Mama," he said, "who are the men outside?" She went to the window. There was nothing there. "What men, David?" "The grey ones. They've been standing by our fence since afternoon." He pressed his face to the glass, unconcerned, curious. "They said they're waiting." The next morning, David didn't want to go play with the neighbors' children. This was unusual. He was a social child, the kind who ran between compounds collecting friends the way other children collected stones. But he sat in the corner of the main room, cross-legged, talking quietly to something Mama Anita couldn't see. "David. Emmanuel's children are calling for you." "I'm busy, Mama." "Doing what?" He looked up at her with an expression she didn't recognize, patient, distant, as if she were the child who didn't understand. "Listening." She sent him outside anyway, and he went without protest but without enthusiasm, his feet dragging. She watched from the doorway as he joined the other children in the compound, but he didn't run. He stood at the edge of their games, looking back toward the house every few minutes, his lips moving slightly. That evening, the smell came. Mama Anita first noticed it when she went to cook, a deep, wet smell, not unpleasant exactly, but wrong for an indoor space. The smell of torn earth after heavy rain. Of deep soil and old roots. It was coming from the corner where she'd stacked the cassava harvest, and when she went to investigate, she found nothing unusual. Just the tubers, piled neatly, waiting. But that night she woke at 2 a.m. to hear David talking. Not crying, not restless, talking, in a low, conversational tone, the way children speak when they've found an interesting companion. She went to his room. He was lying in his bed with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling, murmuring words she couldn't quite catch. David. He turned to look at her, and for just a moment, less than a second, a trick of the lantern light, his eyes looked flat and grey. Go back to sleep, Mama. The mud men are telling me about the hill. A cold thread moved through her chest. What did you say? But his eyes had closed, his breathing deepened, and he was asleep. Or something that looked like sleep. Mama Anita stood in her son's doorway until the cocks crowed, watching the rise and fall of his chest, counting each breath like it was something that could be lost. Perhaps this moment belongs to every parent who has ever stood in a doorway, watching their child sleep, wondering if they've done something irreversible. That fear, the quiet terror of having gone too far, is a human thing, and it never sounds as loud as it does in the middle of the night. If these stories speak to something you carry, stay close. There's more to come.
You saw.
The harvest Mama Anita brought to market stopped
nothing,
conversations mid-sentence. The tubers were flawless, enormous, unblemished, heavy with moisture.
Tell me
She
what
piled them
you
on her
saw.
stall with controlled composure, but inside she was
saw
watching the women's
nothing,
faces and
Mama.
feeling something she hadn't felt in years,
spirits
satisfaction.
know.
Where did you find this? The woman in the
Tell
next
me
stall
what
asked,
you
her voice
saw.
tight with the specific envy of someone
I-
pretending to be merely curious. Good soil, Mama Anita said simply. Proper preparation. By noon she had sold everything. Twice she was offered double the asking price. A trader from the city bought the largest tubers in bulk and asked if she could supply weekly. She said yes before the word was fully formed in her mind. She walked home with more money than she'd seen in a year, and for a few hours, the grey men David had mentioned, the black tuber with its wrong shape, the smell of torn earth in her house, all of it receded. This was what she'd wanted. This was why she'd taken the machete to the hill. But when she got home and went to draw water for cooking, the bucket came up wrong. The water was thick, brown, with a heavy sediment that settled slowly when she held the bucket to the light. She drew again, same result. The well, which had always run clear, was full of mud. She walked to the neighbor's compound and asked to draw from their well. That water was clear. She went home and tried hers again. Mud. She didn't mention it. She fetched water from the neighbor's well for cooking, told herself it was a temporary blockage, would clear itself by morning. She placed her money in the tin beneath her sleeping mat and said a prayer of gratitude that felt, even to her own ears, slightly hollow. That night, David set 3 places for dinner. Who is the third place for? She asked. He looked at the chair as if she'd asked something strange. For the one who visits, he said, and sat down to eat. Mama Anita removed the third bowl. Her hands were steady. But when she looked at the empty chair, she could have sworn she smelled the hill, wet soil, old roots, and something beneath it that had no name she wanted to learn. Baba Tunde came at dusk with his walking stick and his worst expression, not anger, which Mama Anita could have dismissed, but grief. He stood at her compound gate, and she knew before he opened his mouth that this wasn't a social visit. I've seen the trail, he said. She let him in because it would have cost more not to. They sat in her main room, the lantern between them, and he leaned forward with his hands clasped on his stick and spoke without preamble. There are footprints in the spirit world, Anita. The way living people leave tracks in wet sand, the watchers leave marks on the fabric of things. I've been watching that hill for 40 years. I know what its tracks look like. His eyes moved to her harvest pile in the corner. The trail leads here. Directly here. Into this house. You're saying my crops are haunted. I'm saying you carried them here from a place that doesn't belong to the living, and the things that live there follow their property home. He held her gaze. Burn the harvest. Tonight. All of it. Don't sell another tuber, don't cook another root. Burn it, and then we perform the rites to close what you've opened. Mama Anita thought about the trader from the city. She thought about the weekly supply agreement, the money beneath her mat, the feeling of women looking at her stall with envy instead of pity. And the field, she asked. The hill. You abandon it. You go back up there and you make your apologies to the soil and you leave it forever. My debts. Anita. His voice broke on her name. I am begging you. I have watched 3 families destroyed by that hill in my lifetime. It didn't look the same each time, but it felt the same, this exact conversation, this exact refusal to believe until it was too late. Your son is talking to things that should not be spoken to. Your water has turned. The signs are all here. He reached across the table and put his old hand over hers. What is the harvest worth if David is not here to eat it? For a moment, one fragile, honest moment, Mama Anita felt the full weight of what she'd done. It pressed against her chest like earth. Then her pride reassembled itself, and she withdrew her hand. I'll think about it, she said. Baba Tunde rose slowly. At the door, he turned. Don't wait too long to think. She watched him walk into the evening, his figure growing small and then disappearing. Behind her, in the corner, the cassava pile seemed to breathe. The rain began at midnight without warning. Not the gradual build-up of a normal storm, no distant thunder, no shifting wind. One moment the night was dry, the next the sky opened with a violence that shook the walls of Mama Anita's house. Within an hour, water was running through the village paths in rushing channels, washing away the loose soil of the unpaved roads, turning the compound into a shallow lake. Mama Anita woke David and moved him to the high sleeping mat. She checked the door, the windows, the roof. The rain hammered everything with equal ferocity. At 2 in the morning, she tried to open the front door to check on her gate, and found she couldn't push it outward. The water outside had risen to knee height, and the pressure held it closed. They were trapped. Are you scared, Mama? David asked from his mat. He didn't sound scared himself. He sounded curious, and something else she couldn't name. No, she said, which was mostly a lie. The lantern light threw strange shadows across the room. Outside, the rain roared. Inside, beneath the sound of the storm, Mama Anita became aware of another sound, lower, rhythmic, coming from the corner where the harvest was stacked. Not a mechanical sound. An organic one. The slow, wet sound of something growing. She took the lantern and crossed to the corner. In the amber light, she could see that the cassava roots had changed. Overnight, in the warmth of the enclosed room, they had begun to sprout. But the shoots were not the pale, tender white of normal cassava sprouting in the dark. They were black. Thin and black, curling slowly upward from the tubers like the fingers of hands that had just remembered they existed. David, she said carefully, go into the bedroom and close the door. The mudmen say not to be afraid of them, he replied, still on the mat, watching the corner with calm, flat eyes. David. Her voice was iron. Bedroom. Now. He went. She turned back to the corner and watched the black vines reach, slowly, inexorably, toward the walls of her home. By 3 in the morning, the vines had reached the door. Mama Anita stood in the center of her main room with her machete in her hand, watching them spread across the floor with the slow, horrible patience of something that had all the time in the world. They moved like roots looking for water, probing the gaps at the base of the door, winding around the door frame, tightening. She caught at them. The machete severed the nearest vine, and where it was cut, dark liquid welled up, the same dark sap she'd seen when her blade first bit into the hill's soil. The smell filled the room instantly, deep earth, old bones, the cold mineral breath of underground places. The cut end of the vine didn't retreat. It split into two, each new tendril continuing its patient exploration of the room's perimeter. She cut again. 2 became 4. 4 became 8. Stop, she whispered to herself, or to the vines, or to the decision she'd made 22 days ago with her machete on the hill. Stop, stop, stop. She checked the windows next. They were already covered, thin black vines layered across the glass from outside, filtering the moonlight into something that moved wrongly. She tried the back door. Sealed. The front door. Sealed. The house smelled entirely like the hill now. Not faintly, not reminiscently, completely. As if the walls of her home had been transplanted to that silent, impossible hilltop, and everything that lived there had simply come indoors. David's bedroom door opened. He stood in the doorway in his sleeping clothes, his eyes wide but not frightened. Interested. "They are almost ready," he said. "Who is almost ready?" "The mud men. They said they waited a long time. They said they waited since before Grandma was born." He looked at his mother with those flat, patient eyes. "They said you have something that belongs to them, and they've come to collect it." Mama Anita pulled her son behind her. She stood between him and the harvest pile, machete raised, the lantern behind her throwing her shadow enormous across the vine-covered wall. The cassava in the corner had stopped sprouting. It had started dissolving, collapsing inward, the flesh turning dark and liquid, pouring back into the floorboards as if the earth below was drinking it. And from the places where it had been, the floorboards began to crack. Something was rising. They came through the floor like memory, slow, inevitable, deeply familiar in the way that nightmares are familiar. The watchers were not what Mama Anita had imagined when she'd have believed in them, and not what she'd imagined now that belief was no longer a question. They were not monsters with claws and mouths full of teeth. They were shapes, dense, earthen, made of the same black soil she'd torn with her machete. Featureless faces. Shoulders like roots finding their way around stones. They moved the way water moves downhill, without hurry, without doubt, without any interest in being stopped. There were 4 of them. Then 6. Then too many to count, filling the small room with the smell of the hill, pressing the air out until every breath Mama Anita drew tasted like soil. They ignored her entirely. Their attention was on David. He stood behind her, his hand gripping her wrapper, and when the nearest watcher turned its featureless face toward him, he took a step forward, not in fear, but as if answering a call. "David, don't move." Her voice came out rough with terror. He stopped, but she felt his hand tugging gently on her wrapper, not to escape but the way children tug when they want to show you something. "Mama," he said quietly. "They are crying." She could hear nothing. "What do you mean?" "Inside. They are crying. They've been crying for a very long time." The nearest watcher reached out toward David, and Mama Anita raised her machete, and felt the absolute uselessness of it in her hand. What could still do to something made of earth and time and grief? She had used this blade to begin this disaster, and it would no more stop it than a match extinguishes the fire it starts. And then, in her terror, with the machete useless in her hand and her son being drawn toward something ancient and implacable, Mama Anita did the only thing she had left. She began to hum. It was her mother's lullaby, the song from her own childhood, the one her grandmother had sung before that, the one that had traveled through her bloodline like an inheritance. She didn't choose it consciously. It simply came, the way breath comes, automatic and necessary. The watcher stopped. In the stillness, she understood what Baba Tunde had never told her, perhaps because he didn't know, or perhaps because some lessons cannot be taught. They can only be arrived at through the specific terror of almost losing everything. The Watchers were not demons. They were mothers. Centuries old, their bodies long returned to the very soil she'd violated, but their grief as fresh and fierce as the day they died defending that land. They had recognized in Mama Anita something they knew from their own lifetimes, a mother whose love had calcified into ambition, who had mistaken provision for devotion and forgotten that a child needs presence more than prosperity. They hadn't come for David's soul. They'd come to claim a child whose mother had, inch by inch, forgotten to love him properly. And they had almost succeeded because, for a terrible moment, they were right. The hum broke something open in Mama Anita that she hadn't known was closed. She sang through tears she didn't notice falling, the lullaby her mother had given her, and she'd been too busy surviving to give her son, and in the singing she understood everything the hill had been trying to tell her since the first machete blow. The Watchers didn't dissolve. They didn't retreat dramatically. They simply receded, the way the tide recedes, still present in the water table, still real, but no longer crowding the shore. The black vines loosened at the doors and windows. The smell of the hill remained but softened, becoming less like a warning and more like a reminder. Mama Anita dropped to her knees on the vine-cracked floor and pulled David to her chest so tightly he squeaked. She held him until her arms shook, until the feeling returned to her hands, until she was certain, absolutely certain, that he was solid and warm and completely present. "I'm here, Mama," he said patiently against her shoulder. "I've been here the whole time." "I know," she managed. "I know. I'm sorry." When the rain slowed to ordinary rain and the vines had died back to ordinary darkness, she gathered David in a blanket and they stepped over the collapsed harvest pile and out the front door into the flooded compound. She left everything in the house. The money beneath the mat. The remaining tubers. The beautiful, terrible harvest that had come from a place where the dead kept their most important memories. She walked to Baba Tunde's house in the pre-dawn darkness, her son on her back even though he was too old for it, his weight the most honest thing she'd felt in months. The old man opened his door before she knocked. He looked at her face and understood. He performed the rites at sunrise, offerings returned to the hill, apologies made in the proper language, the soil spoken to with the respect it was owed. Mama Anita knelt in the mud of the Wailing Hill and addressed the earth in her mother's voice, the same voice she'd used for the lullaby, and she meant every word. The house came down 3 days later. Not dramatically, it simply began to sink, the floor cracking, the walls settling, as if the earth was slowly reclaiming what she'd disturbed. By the end of the week, there was nothing left but a shallow depression and a smell of wet soil after rain. Mama Anita rebuilt on the other side of the village, with Baba Tunde's help and the community's cautious goodwill. She farmed properly now, the ordinary hard work of ordinary soil that yielded ordinary harvests, and she found it was enough. More than enough, actually, when you counted correctly, when you counted David's laughter and his real conversations and the way he ran toward her when she came home rather than sitting in corners speaking to things she couldn't see. She told anyone who would listen about the hill. She became, in her own way, a guardian of the story, not a comfortable one, not the kind that softened the edges, but the true version, with all its shame intact. Some people listened. Some didn't. Some people, she'd learned, need to pick up the machete themselves before they understand what the blade is really cutting. But she told the story anyway. Because the truth, like the Watchers, is patient. It will wait as long as it needs to. And eventually, it always comes home.